Great expectations. I wish it was only me that got put out. Pip. I wish there warn't no tickler for you, old chap. I wish I could take it all on myself, but this is the up and down and straight on it. Pip. And I hope you'll overlook shortcomings. Young as I was, I believe that I dated a new admiration of Joe from that night. We were equals afterwards, as we had been before, but afterwards at quiet times when I sat looking at Joe and thinking about him, I had a new sensation of feeling conscious that I was looking up to Joe in my heart. However, said Joe, rising to replenish the fire, here's the Dutch clock a-working himself up to being equal to strike 8 of M, and she's not come home yet. I hope Uncle Pumblechook's mare mayn't have set a 4-foot on a piece o' ice, and gone down. Mrs. Joe made occasional trips with Uncle Pumblechook on market days, to assist him in buying such household stuffs and goods as required a woman's judgment, Uncle Pumblechook being a bachelor and reposing no confidences in his domestic servant. This was market day, and Mrs. Joe was out on one of these expeditions. Joe made the fire and swept the hearth, and then we went to the door to listen for the chaise cart. It was a dry cold night, and the wind blew keenly, and the frost was white and hard. A man would die tonight of lying out on the marshes, I thought. And then I looked at the stars, and considered how awful it would be for a man to turn his face up to them as he froze to death, and see no help or pity in all the glittering multitude. Here comes the mare, said Joe, ringing like a peal of bells. The sound of her iron shoes upon the hard road was quite musical, as she came along at a much brisker trot than usual. We got a chair out, ready for Mrs. Joe's alighting, and stirred up the fire that they might see a bright window, and took a final survey of the kitchen that nothing might be out of its place. When we had completed these preparations, they drove up, wrapped to the eyes. Mrs. Joe was soon landed, and Uncle Pumblechook was soon down too, covering the mare with a cloth, and we were soon all in the kitchen, carrying so much cold air in with us that it seemed to drive all the heat out of the fire. Now, said Mrs. Joe, unwrapping herself with haste and excitement, and throwing her bonnet back on her shoulders where it hung by the strings, if this boy aren't grateful this night, he never will be. I looked as grateful as any boy possibly could, who was wholly uninformed why he ought to assume that expression. It's only to be hoped, said my sister, that he won't be pomp-eyed. But I have my fears. She aren't in that line, Mum, said Mr. Pumblechook. She knows better. She. I looked at Joe, making the motion with my lips and eyebrows. She? Joe looked at me, making the motion with his lips and eyebrows. She. My sister catching him in the act, he drew the back of his hand across his nose with his usual conciliatory air on such occasions, and looked at her. Well, said my sister, in her snappish way, what are you staring at? Is the house afire? Which some individual, Joe politely hinted, mentioned, she. And she is a she, I suppose, said my sister. Unless you call Miss Havisham or he. And I doubt if even you'll go so far as that. Miss Havisham. Uptown, said Joe. Is there any Miss Havisham downtown? Returned my sister. She wants this boy to go and play there. And of course he's going. And he had better play there, said my sister, shaking her head at me as an encouragement to be extremely light and sportive. Or I'll work him. I had heard of Miss Havisham uptown. Everybody for miles round had heard of Miss Havisham uptown as an immensely rich and grim lady who lived in a large and dismal house barricaded against robbers, and who led a life of seclusion. Well, to be sure, said Joe, astounded. I wonder how she come to know Pip. Noodle, cried my sister. Who said she knew him? Which some individual? Joe again politely hinted. Mentioned that she wanted him to go and play there. And couldn't she ask Uncle Pumblechook if he knew of a boy to go and play there? Isn't it just barely possible that Uncle Pumblechook may be a tenant of hers, and that he may sometimes, we won't say quarterly or half-yearly, for that would be requiring too much of you, but sometimes, go there to pay his rent? And couldn't she then ask Uncle Pumblechook if he knew of a boy to go and play there? And couldn't Uncle Pumblechook, being always considerate and thoughtful for us, though you may not think it, Joseph, in a tone of the deepest